There are 4 concepts in this video we're going to discuss that you need to know for your real estate licensing exam. Police powers, taxation, eminent domain, and escheat. Those 4 concepts in this video. Hey everybody, my name is Vojchehoske and welcome to Randall School of Real Estate's YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to discuss some concepts that place government restrictions on privately owned property. They are police powers, eminent domain, taxation, meaning real estate taxation, and escheat. So let's take a look at these 4 concepts. Moving on to page 23 and 24. Now remember, I went back and said that the July 4th, 1776, July 5th actually, we had this thing called the alloidal system, and now we have the bundle of rights. Individual owners have the bundle of rights. Or a settler that was settling in the Louisiana Purchase and the government transferred the ownership of that property to them through a land patent. Now all of a sudden they have the bundle of rights. There was a time in this country when if somebody was simply trespassing on your property, you could shoot and kill them and nothing could be done to you. Since 1776, obviously, the government has placed substantial regulations and restrictions on the on private ownership. And it starts on page 24. There's an acronym you really should know. It's called PETE, P-E-T-E, and it stands for Police Powers, Eminent Domain, Taxation, and a Doctrine of Escheat, E-S-C-H-E-A-T-E. And we need to know what these are. So it's a good idea on page 24 to highlight right at the top there, the right to police power, the right to eminent domain, the right to tax, and the right to escheat. So make sure that you highlight those. Now the first one I want to talk about is taxes. We're not going to go exactly in order, P-E-T-E. I'm going to follow the book here. The first restriction that the government places on individuals' bundle of rights is taxation. And we're all familiar with property tax. Taxation is private ownership is subject to government taxation for the common good of the general public. We have public schools, and in Nebraska, most of public schools are funded by property taxes. Any type of tax that's assessed onto the consumer is called an or on a property owner is called ad valorem tax. That's its legal name. And there are 2 ways to calculate property taxes. And if you look on page 25, there are samples of this and how you calculate these property taxes using the mill levy system and the dollar value system. Now we use jurisdictions like Nebraska use mill levy system when there's more than one government jurisdiction that has access to taxing your property. In Nebraska, we have schools and counties and cities and colleges, and everybody and their mother has access to taxing your property. So we use the mill levy system. So each jurisdiction can individually assess a mill levy. Then we have the valuation based on the tax based on the dollar in value. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to cut away to a different video and it'll explain to you how we calculate this. And just keep in mind for tax purpose or for test purposes at Randall and on the licensing exam, you have to know how to calculate property tax. So let's get to that video. I'm going to use the example that's in the book. And in the book, it's based on a test question. And it says basically, now we're going to do figuring out the taxes that are owed using the mill levy system. We'll get to the second one later on in this video, but let's see what it says. It says 1234 Main Street has an appraised value of $180,000. The county taxes the property owners at a rate of 30% of the appraised value. The mill levy is decimal 080. What are the taxes owed? And remember, anytime you work a math problem, whether it's figuring out property taxes or any other math problem, it's about a process. So we plug numbers into the process here. And I've given you the process on the board here. We start with the appraised value, and on our math problem that's in the book, the assessed value is $180,000. That's where we always start with. The county taxes at 30% of the appraised value. So in the book, you'll see that it's decimal 30. There's a couple of ways you can do it this way, or if you have a calculator, you can take $180,000 and multiply it by 30 and then hit, so you type in 30 and hit the percent key, and either way you come up with the assessed value. And in this math problem, the assessed value is $54,000. The next part is we take the $54,000, which is the assessed value, and we multiply it by the mill levy, which is decimal 080. And when we do the math, we multiply 54,000 by 080, we get the tax owed, which is $4,320. So as you can see, this is our process to figure out how much is owed. The math problem will give you all the numbers that you need, but you need to know where to plug those numbers in. And you have to have 3 out of the 5 to get the answer, or 3 out of the 4 to get the answer. So you need the appraised value, the tax rate, and the mill levy. If you have those 3 and you can remember the process, you'll always know how to get your tax amount that's owed. The second method for governmental bodies to calculate your property taxes is using a dollar amount. And in this example, or the example that's in your book, it's based on a math problem or a property tax problem that says 4567 Main Street has an appraised value of $180,000. The county assesses $2.75 per $100 of value, meaning the property's value. What are the taxes that are owed? Now again, just like the previous math problem, you got to know the process. And if you know the process, then you know where to plug the numbers in. And the math question will always give you the numbers. You just got to know where to plug those numbers into the process. This one here is actually a little bit simpler to figure out. So in our example in the book, we have an appraised value of $180,000. And we're going to multiply that, again, knowing the process here, it's $2.75 per $100 of the property's value. So we express that, going back to 4th grade math, that is going to be 0.0275. So when we multiply 180,000 by decimal 0.0275, that gives us a tax amount of $4,950. Now there's a little trick that I've learned over the years, because sometimes the math problem might express this as $2.75 per $100 of value, or $2.75 per $1,000 of value. So the way that we figure that out, a shortcut here, is we know it's $2.75, right? So if it's $100 per value, we know there's 2 zeros in 100, so we simply move the decimal place 2 spaces. 2 zeros, we move the decimal place 2 places. If it says $1,000 of property's value, then we know to move the decimal place 3 spaces. So we would take $180,000 and multiply it by decimal 0.0275, because we've moved that decimal place to the left based on the number of zeros in our value. Just a quick little, just a shortcut that I've learned over the years. All right, welcome back. On page 25, I want to talk about special assessments. I know it's not on your screen there, but real quick, special assessments, I would highlight that first sentence there. Here's what a special assessment is. Not every state uses special assessments, but we do here in Nebraska. So let's say that the city is going to, let's say a subdivider is going to, they're developing 500 acres and they're going to divide it into 500 individual lots. Well, they got to go in and put streets in and sewers and lights and all that kind of sidewalks. So what they're going to do is put an assessment on each one of those 500 lots that are in that subdivision. And let's say that in its totality, it's $10,000 per lot that's going to be assessed to pay for all of that. You're paying your fair share of the total assessment. Well, that's called a special assessment. So the seller would have to pay that. One thing that we're seeing here in Omaha is there are many parts of the city where the roads aren't up to standard, and it's up to the individual owners that live on that street to pay for the repavement of that road. And so what would happen is the city would come in, pay for it, they would repave the road, and then attach a special assessment to each one of the landowners that lives adjacent to that street, and that would be called a special assessment. Eminent domain. That's one of the E's in Pete, okay? Eminent domain, and we're on page 25 here, and you probably need to highlight the first two, actually that first little paragraph there. It says the rights of eminent domain permits the government to take private property for public use with just compensation to the owner. The act of taking property is accomplished through the process of condemnation. So they actually condemn the property. Now, every government organization or entity has access to claim personal property through eminent domain. All right, so whether it's a school district that needs to build a new school, or the federal government that needs to put a military base, or an interstate, or the state, every government agency has the right to take personal property by eminent domain. The key here is, and there's some keys to remember. Number one, title passes, and this is the first time I'm introducing that term, title. Title in real estate means ownership. And from here on out, when I'm referring to ownership, I'm going to use the word title. So I've highlighted it there. Title in real estate means ownership. We pass title, meaning we pass ownership. So the key here is title passes, or ownership passes, from the private owner to that government agency. They use the legal process that they use for this is called the condemnation proceeding. So the government comes in and they condemn the property, and then they use the condemnation process to get title. Now, the private owner is compensated. That's required under the Constitution of the United States. Prior to 1776, remember, the king owned everything, and he could do whatever he wanted. It was his land. But one of the reasons this was put in the Constitution is to prevent the government from simply taking your land and not paying its fair market value. So they have to compensate you, all right? And the way that they do that is they typically send out 3 independent appraisers, and then they take the average of those 3 appraisals, and that's deemed to be fair market value, and that's what the government's going to pay you. So title passes, they use the condemnation process, and they must compensate the owner if they take land using eminent domain. Page 26. The next thing we're going to talk about is a term or a doctrine called escheat. And the way I remembered this when I was a student is the root word cheat, escheat. And it basically means reverting or lapsing of property back to the state, in our case, the county or the government, by a legal process, and the legal process is known as escheat. Now, when do we use escheat? There's a couple of ways. Number one is we use escheat when somebody dies and there's no heir. They had no will, so I die, I have no will, and I absolutely have no family members, none. They're all gone. In that case, the government has to have a mechanism to wind that estate or liquidate the estate. So what happens is all my property then becomes, it reverts to or escheats to the state. I like to, when I was in your position, I would remember the word cheat. So when I die and I have no heirs and there's no will, that means that the government's cheating me out of the value that I've accumulated over my life. So that's how a little way I used to remember this. The other thing is title passes. So ownership passes from my estate to the state of Nebraska or the county or whoever the proper governmental entity is. So one other thing, this is a little bit later doctrine. I think this actually came into play about the early 1900s, is how does a city or a county deal with a non-existent property owner? So I own a property on 12th and Main Street, and I live in California, and it was a rental property, and now it's just a den for drug dealers and prostitutes. The city or the county has to have a way to go in and deal with that. And so in this case, under escheat, the city can go in and get legal title to that property. And there's a process that's used called escheat, but they can ultimately get the title to that property, and title passes, but they do not have to compensate me, the owner, when they use escheat. Again, think of it this way, and that is, I was a non-existent owner. They notified me many times that this is a drug house and they're running prostitution out of there. So it's an impediment on the community. Why should the state, because the state has to go in, or the city or the county has to go in and deal with this, why should they compensate me? And that's kind of the idea behind it. So again, on page 26, those first two little paragraphs there you need to highlight because you might see them on a test. All right, moving on here. The last, the number 4 of 4, where the government having control over real estate or personal property, is police powers. Now, the doctrine of police powers over the last 30 years has grown substantially here, particularly in environmental and things like the Endangered Species Act. So police powers is a doctrine that gives the government the right to use or regulate your personal property, your real property, but title does not pass, and the property owner is not compensated, and many times the owners have no control over it, and the owner is responsible for compliance costs or any ramifications of that regulation that the government imposes. So for example, common ones are zoning laws, building codes, environmental regulations, subdivision restrictions, those type of things. They place restrictions on your property. There's no compensation. You have to comply. And oh, by the way, you're responsible to comply with this. I actually had a student many, many years ago in my class, and they were from Oregon, and they had purchased 40 acres of woodland that they were going to use to cut the trees down and sell for wood. Well, the federal government came in and designated that property is the spotted owl was put on the endangered species list. So it basically rendered that property worthless. They couldn't harvest any of the lumber because it would disturb that spotted owl who was on the endangered species list. The government gave them no compensation. They had an $8 million mortgage on this property. Now they're still responsible to pay the mortgage, but they can't harvest any of the lumber. So that's what I'm talking about when I say that there's no compensation and you're responsible for the consequences of that federal regulation. State and local governments can impose the same kind of rules. We call that police powers.
All right, that's all I have in today's video. More Study Buddy videos to my right. Go ahead and click on that link. And if you have not subscribed to our channel, please do so. Click the little circle right there and hit that little notification bell. I will see you in the next video.